call the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to begin by reminding Mr Andrew Williams, who just made that contribution, that his much admired leader, Winston Peters, was the champion of selling assets when he was the Treasurer in the late 1990s. His signature is actually on the documents that enabled the government to sell its shares in Auckland International Airport. And just for the record with Mr Andrew Williams, I'd like to say that at the time, Mr Winston Peters, the leader of the New Zealand First, said that the sale of shares in New Zealand First was to be celebrated as popular capitalism. Popular capitalism. And so my challenge to Andrew Williams and to New Zealand First is that this is awful double standards. When Winston Peters is a minister and a treasurer, he signs documents to enable the quite sensible floating of a very successful company like Auckland International Airport, but now he happens to be in opposition. He sings a very different tune, and that just shows not just how shallow the argument is, but how shallow this bill is. Let me come to the sponsor of this bill, a Mr Clayton Cosgrove. And I have a very simple question for Mr Cosgrove. Where was he when the previous Labour government in 2007 sold 49% of the shares in the Spring Creek mine? I've gone back and looked at the cabinet papers. Clayton Cosgrove was in the cabinet room when 49%, a shareholding worth tens of millions of dollars, was sold by the previous Labour government. Did Mr Cosgrove on that occasion say that that sale of shares cannot proceed until such time as there is a 75% majority as proposed by this bill? Of course not. He did not say boo. In fact, Mr Mallard is interjecting. Mr Mallard's signature is on the papers that enabled a sale of 49% shares in Spring Creek Mine. Now, Mr Mallard has just cried out in the House that he's proud of that. He's proud of that. So now we know the policy of the Labour Party. When the Labour Party sells shares in state companies, it's a good thing. When some other government sells shares, suddenly it becomes a bad thing, and that certainly does not stand up to any sort of integrity in terms of policy and history. And I do want to take back, because, Mr Speaker, in my early days of involvement in politics, I remember very well in Christchurch. And Clayton Cosgrove was a campaign worker for Mike Moore. And, yeah, well, I wasn't that much older. But Mr Cosgrove, I remember that very well. Because at that time, there was a Labour government. It wasn't just selling a little bit of assets. They sold 20 state-owned enterprises, which in today's terms would be worth over $30 billion. And where was Mr Cosgrove? No. Mr Cosgrove was very strongly supporting those sales. Was he demanding at that time? And I'll tell you the difference, Mr Cosgrove. Let me explain the difference. In 2011, National went to the electorate with a very clear policy around mixed ownership. What was different, Mr Cosgrove, was that when the Labour Party sold a large number, 100% of the shares, and a large number of state businesses, there was absolutely no mandate at all. And that's really the difference. The difference between, well, Mr Andrew Little chips in. I'd love him to say, where was he when he was Labour Party president and 49% of the shares were sold in Spring Creek? Where was Mr Little? Mr Little was silent. And that's where there is a
Sorry to
double standard.
interrupt
and
the
this bill is a
honourable member.
nonsense.
His time has expired. The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to make a long speech on this bill. I would note that going from the last point that my colleague